Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on the DPS rankings in Dragonflight. We'll compare last week's numbers from Warcraft log parses in all three categories, Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus, to how the DPS specializations stacked up in week 9. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start like we always do by checking in on the rankings from last week. This is coming off of some pretty big changes and some buffs and nerfs from 10.0.5 with some settling in as we go into weeks. And of course, we now do have the major changes we got in a hotfix for several classes. Many of them got major damage increases. Hunters got 5% across the board. Frost DKs, Blood DKs got damage increases. Damage increase for Protection Paladin. Everything kind of went all over the place. We saw a big increase for Shadow, Devastation, and several other classes that were struggling before. We'll see if some of the big trends that we saw from last week continued on into this week. And boom, we are into week 9. So there's a couple things to talk about here. Firstly, we saw that Survival Hunter is not in the bottom of all three categories. Finally broke their trend of that. Of course, the 5% buff across the board for all Hunter specs did have a quite meaningful impact on their performance. But let's go through the list from top to bottom. All of the numbers are stacked together on the right, so you can see how they stack together in each category, and then the overall added in all PvE, who comes out on top. And again, we're seeing Enhancement Shaman at the top. What was different about this from last week, we saw Enhancement not really take first or second in many of the categories, but they were so unbelievably consistent in the top 3 that they were able to pull a total score above everyone else last week. They did actually score a Balanced Druid, Subtlety Rogue, and Enhancement Shaman tied in max Mythic Plus scoring this week. So they were actually the exact same number, shockingly enough. A lot of groups were running these and maybe subbing out a Windwalker or, some other classes that work well with that, depending on your comp. But super, super strong Enhancement, killing it in Mythic Plus. And when left to their own devices in Heroic Raid, they're a cut above every other class except Unholy DK when it comes to just standing there and parsing like a monster. Enhancement Shaman still doing quite well. In Mythic Raid this week, Enhancement Shaman dropped down quite a bit. They fell down about 4 positions, so they didn't score as highly as they did last week. But again, the trend that we're seeing, as I've been covering this every week since launch, is that Mythic Raid, the Mythic Raiders that still clear every single week, man, they get so creative, and their parses change every week on what they want to try out and how things work. So Enhancement dropping down, but some cool, good news coming forward on that as well. In second place is Devastation Evoker. They actually outparsed the Shadow Priests in Mythic Raid this week. They did excellent in Heroic Raid, and they still did quite poorly in Mythic Plus. So Devastation Evokers, they were about average across the board. They weren't really above the fold in any, they weren't really they weren't above average in any way since the start of the season. And they've gotten many, many buffs and tweaks to help alleviate that. And it looks like all of those changes that they've been making since December on Devastation Evokers has really kicked in. They're actually doing excellent in Raid. They are parsing among the best of them, in the best this week in Mythic Raid overall. So they're killing it in Raid and are very reliable there. However, in Mythic Plus, they are still doing quite poorly relative to other classes in general. Some of this might just be how long their breath cooldowns are, their actual wind-up cooldowns are, and how much they rely on Dragonfire in order to do their AoE damage, but still not doing super hot in Mythic Plus. Havoc DK actually took 3rd overall this week. They did maybe slightly less than usual in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, but they actually did quite well in Heroic Raid this week. They haven't really received major changes in actually quite a while. I mean, they've had kind of minor things here and there. The most of the changes they've had have been in PvP, so they've kind of held on to that. So there's not really a whole lot of noteworthy things for Havoc. They're just good. Shadow Priest taking 4th overall, primarily to their Mythic Raid parsing this week for just PvE Raid DPS. They're among the top 6 in Heroic Raid, And they're in the top third or so for Mythic Plus. So those crazy, they got some crazy buffs, then they chilled out for a while. And then in the last patch, the big thing that they got was a lot of their class tree abilities now also give insanity, which I didn't expect it to have that big of an effect on them. But now that their class tree abilities give them regular insanity, it actually had a pretty substantial impact on their ability to deal damage and perform in all styles of content. I didn't expect it to be this big. I knew it was going to be nice, but I didn't expect it to be this big. So that's Shadow. Unholy DK is in the 5th overall, almost entirely because of their Heroic Raid parses. Now, these are max parses in Heroic Raid for DPS classes. And again, if you PI Unholy DK and you let them go crazy, they can outdamage anyone. They are just absolutely crazy. But when difficulty's on the line, you need them to be consistently performing without constrained, without a sandbox environment where they can do whatever they want. They're just not keeping up in the harder content. Now, keep in mind, I don't know if the change went live yet, but Blizzard did mention that they are going to be adding in a marker in the Warcraft parses that lets you actually tell if someone got PI or not. So you can actually have a flag where you can search and say, okay, I want to look at parses that didn't have power infusion. So maybe that could be an interesting way to look at Unholy DK. They do have an amazing opener. They rely heavily on haste. So crazy haste inflections like that can be really good for Unholy DK. And I'm curious to see if we parse that out, what that actually looks like for Unholy. Underneath Unholy DK overall is Frost Mage, primarily because of their performance in Raid. They're about average in Mythic Plus, but they're doing quite well in Mythic Raid. They're still not parsing as crazily as the Arcane Mage. I think Arcane Mage has been holding on to a high spot in Heroic Raid ever since the launch. But with all the changes and buffs that they've gotten, Frost Mage and Fire Mage both got their core abilities buffed. And then on top of that, several weeks later, they got a big 5% damage buff on everything on top of their core abilities being buffed as well. And that actually worked out. We're slowly seeing Fire Mage and Frost Mage creep their way up since 10.0.5 and recent changes. So they're actually doing pretty well. And in difficult content, Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, Frost Mage and Fire Mage are both outperforming Arcane Mage, whereas Arcane Mage was dominating in the start of Season 1. The first 5 or 6 weeks or so, it was Arcane Mage through and through. Underneath Frost Mage is Arms Warrior. Shockingly, they've been climbing up. Fury Warrior has been climbing up a little bit in difficult content, but Arms is starting to parse insane. They were 5th overall in Mythic Raid. So the bored Mythic Raiders that clear every week, they are testing out the lengths that Arms can go to. Then they're doing a lot better in Mythic Plus. It was a pretty good week, affix-wise, for Warriors and for Melee. So they were able to kind of take advantage of that. But in general, they did quite well. Subtlety Rogue is next in the overall scoring, primarily because of their Mythic Plus scoring. They're still Outlaw and Subtlety, still the best class you can bring, essentially are in the top 3 or 4 for Mythic Plus clearing. They're just so incredibly reliable. They have amazing tools that allow them to really do some cool stuff. They don't parse as well in Heroic Raid, which shows that they're just raw, target dummy, standing still, damage output when everything's going right, doesn't stack up to other classes. But when you have to move and do mechanics and switch targets and kill adds and you have to factor in doing, all these extra things, they actually do just fine. They're able to switch targets effectively, move effectively, and they have good tools that help the group out. But, their raw damage output is not as much as others, and that's why they've kind of slayed a little bit in the overall rankings. Balanced Druid underneath Subtlety, primarily because of their Mythic Plus. Same thing goes for Rogues. They're actually doing better than they were before in Heroic Raid, but Mythic Raid, they're still struggling. I think they do have some issues with a small number of cleave damage output, and they also do have some issues switching targets as well compared to some of the other ranged DPS that may be in the same boat as them. Fire Mage under Balance Druid, they are again up. Fire is starting to come alive. Fire actually outparsed all of the mage specializations in Mythic Raid this week. They were in top 4 somehow, and I would love to pull Power Infusion out of that one just to see where they land. But shockingly, the board Mythic Raiders are testing out other specs to see how they go, and Fire Mage actually did quite well this week. They didn't do as well in Heroic Raid. This could just be maybe a lower skill or a higher skill floor, or maybe a higher skill ceiling for Fire Mage, but they did okay. And then same thing goes for Mythic Plus. Frost Mage, Fire Mage did about average. They actually were outperformed by Shadow Priest and even Destruction Warlock in the caster department. Windwalker is down, actually. They are still top 4 for Mythic Plus, but their output for Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid is about average in general. This, you know, they're a little bit better in Mythic Raid, but yeah, I guess they're just, I'm not sure exactly what would cause this particular situation. Maybe it's just because more of the lower classes like Shadow Priest, the Mage specs, Devastation, Evoker, we even have Demonology coming up, Affliction coming up. All these classes coming up are pushing some of the previous victors standing at the top, but Windwalker is no longer in that top 5, top 6 position. They've slipped a little bit. Arcane Mage is kind of topping, is like rounding out the middle of the pack here. They are doing still very well in Heroic Raid, and this has kind of always been Arcane Mage over the last 10 years. They're so good at standing, like just hammering a single target really well. Arcane Mage has always excelled at that. But when it goes into Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, they are now Mythic Plus bottom 4 and then bottom 7 for Mythic Raid, which is kind of sad to see considering how good they started the season. Beast Mastery and Marksmanship are in the middle here, and they're very closely tied together. Remember that all 3 of the Hunter specializations got a 5% damage increase to all of their abilities and all of the pet damage output as well. So they got this flat 5%, and that actually helped them out a lot. You can see it, Beast Mastery ended up doing quite well in Heroic Raid, actually being in the top 3rd there, and then about average for Mythic Plus and Mythic Raid. And shockingly, Marksmanship was in the top 3 for Mythic Raid. I swear to God, it's just bored Mythic Raiders that see changes. They're like, hey, I'm gonna bring my Hunter this week. Let me see how much I can push it. Let's do like maximum consumables, buff me up. Let's see what I can do with this. Since we already have it on farm, I'm not gonna worry about it. So Marksmanship did amazingly in Mythic Raid. That wasn't really as represented in Heroic Raid, being slightly below average, and then in the bottom 5 for Mythic Plus. In fact, this week, Marksmanship did about just slightly above Survival in Mythic Plus. Shockingly, just was not a good week for Mythic Plus Marksmanship. Demonology, and remember that Demonology and Destruction both got damage increases with the last hotfix change. So they did get some nice buffs going into that. Demonology just starting out the bottom 3rd of the list. They're starting to bring that one forward. They did quite well in Heroic Raid, top 3rd. So they were able to parse exceptionally. They did about average in Mythic Raid and just below average in Mythic Plus. So I would say the buffs were pretty effective for them. They didn't really get any major changes in 10.0.5, but I guess the changes that they got recently were enough to help bring them up a little bit. And they're actually doing pretty well in raid situations, which is cool. Underneath Demonology is Fury Warrior. They're able to move up this week because of their Mythic Plus performance. They were about average in Mythic Raid and in the bottom 3rd for Heroic Raid, which is quite unfortunate, but they are coming up from what they were. They started season 1 at the top 5, and then they started slipping every single week, but it seems like that hemorrhaging has stopped, and they're starting to climb again, as is Arms Warrior. So Warriors are coming back. In the last 2 weeks or so, they've been doing much better than previously before. Outlaw Rogue is just under Fury, and again, this is just because their Mythic Plus performance. They're about slightly below average in Mythic Raid, and they're down towards the bottom in Heroic Raid. So damage output in a raid environment for Outlaw, not as good as it used to be, but they do amazingly well in Mythic Plus. And you know, if they have some pretty fun cleave opportunities where they can really get you know, the flurries going, they can get some serious damage buffs, they can do some really cool big trash pulls in Mythic Plus, and then they can do okay on bosses. But when it comes to raid, they're not performing as well relative to the other specializations in the game. Ret Paladin has kind of solidified its spot. You can see they're in about the same position in all 3 categories: Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus. When Ret got that big buff, all the Mythic Raiders brought their Ret Paladins to test them out. Ret had an amazing week that week, and then ever since, people kind of got bored, and I guess they're not bringing them as much anymore into the roster, so we're seeing less parses for Ret, but they're still doing, just below average in all of those categories. This actually is probably one of their better weeks for Mythic Plus in general. Typically, we see them a little bit lower because they just have struggle keeping up with high mobility where they have to constantly move, or they can't really generate holy power in order to spend it properly. But if things are planted, they can do some pretty serious damage. Destruction Warlock is underneath Retribution. They do the best in Mythic Plus, which has kind of been the same thing for Destruction. They usually excel at 2 target cleave fights in Raid, which there aren't too many of those in Vault of the Incarnates. And then they do really well in AoE Mythic Plus clearing. So we'll see them in that spot. The damage buff that they got did impact their Mythic Plus performance. They came up a little bit. It actually doesn't look like their Raid performance was affected by the buffs that they got last week. So yeah, take that for what you will. Feral Druid had a serious fall from grace after 10.0.5, and I still don't know exactly what caused this, but they started doing quite abysmally in Raid relative to other specializations. So you can see them down in the bottom 4 for Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. They still do okay in Mythic Plus, but not as good as Balanced Druid in that damage department, but they still are about where they were, and they didn't really receive major changes, so I didn't really expect them to change this week. Elemental Shaman, about what they were. They are doing about the same in Heroic Raid, maybe slightly better this week in Mythic Plus, and then in the bottom 3 for Mythic Raid. And we talked about this in the last video last week, but part of that's just because they have a completely different build for every situation that they encounter, and they can't have all those builds at once. Their stat distribution changes, their talent tree changes, their rotation changes. They can spec for AoE, they can spec for single target, they can spec for cleave fights, but it's hard for them to do all of them at once. And they actually have pretty respectable AoE. So I think on Fortified weeks, you can bring an Ele Shaman and they can do some serious AoE with stacking earthquakes and things like that. But on Tyrannical weeks, they probably, if they spec single target, their AoE is a little less, especially if you're not running like Magma Totem or things like that. Underneath Elemental Shaman is Affliction Warlock, primarily because of their Mythic Raid performance. Affliction actually this week, the bottom performer in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus. So if you're not in a Mythic guild, fully stacked up and bored and really trying to just test out what specs do what, they are doing pretty bad. But in Mythic Raid, the Mythic guilds brought their Affliction Warlocks this week, and they really tried to stress test, and it actually did okay. It was about average, about the same as Fury Warrior, Beast Mastery, Outlaw. So kind of shocking there, but in the other styles of content, which is, not the top % of raiders with the right support and all the right consumables and everything perfect, they did the worst this week. So kind of surprising there. Frost DK, even after the buffs they received, are still bottom 3 overall. They did pretty bad in Heroic Raid and second to last in Mythic Plus. They did better in Mythic Raid, which tells me that all the Mythic Raiders were pushing Frost DK and still not getting a whole lot out of it. So even the buffs that they got recently that kind of helped bring their DPS to the forefront didn't seem to have a large impact on them, and they're still kind of towards the bottom there at this stage at week 9 in Dragonflight Season 1. Assassination Rogue are, I think they're struggling. They're towards the bottom here. They are second to last. They are second to last in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. They do a little bit better in Mythic Plus because of the toolkit that rogues have. They can clear keys and time properly, and they have a lot of utility. But when it comes to damage output, they maybe just need more. And I think maybe they're focused a little too much on how Assassination is performing in PvP and not looking enough at how they're performing in PvE, but this is where they're at. And of course, last overall is Survival. They did third to last in Mythic Plus, dead last in Mythic Raid, and then they were in the bottom 6 for Heroic Raid. The good news is the gap, the deviation, the data point deviation between the second to last and Survival the last 2 weeks has been bigger. So they actually caught up a little bit relative to the classes that are above them in their overall parsing and performance. So they're actually caught up a little bit with that 5% damage buff across their abilities and their pets' abilities, but they need a lot more. And hopefully we'll start to see more going into 10.0.7 and 10.1, more love for survival, because they kind of been down there in the dumps trying to survive and barely making it. Now, it doesn't mean you can't perform. I've seen some survival hunters parse insanely well, but you need to put in a lot more effort in order to do that with survival relative to other specializations. So that's where we're at. Week 9 DPS rankings. Let me know your thoughts down below. Did anything surprise you? Is there anything that still needs to be done in coming hotfixes or coming patches? And just generally, where's your head at when it comes to DPS rankings at the end of week 9? As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.